All right, tonight we jump into a brand new series. This is a series and a conversation talking about the elephants in the room, the big issues, the questions and challenges of our time that often we don't really know how to talk about in church. If you've been tracking with us in our Sunday morning community, you'll know that for the last couple of years we've been circling back to this conversation again and again, and that's because it's a profoundly important conversation for us to have. As you saw in the video, we live in a time that has lost the art of listening, hasn't it? We live in a time that's lost the art of listening and of talking constructively to one another. Increasingly, we live in echo chambers. We've kind of moved away increasingly culturally from a way of living next to someone and talking over the fence with someone who maybe doesn't agree with you about everything. That maybe it's somebody who has a different political stance or religious view to you, and we've increasingly moved away from that kind of a culture to Facebook culture. The Facebook algorithm, if you don't know, works on the basis that when you like something, or when you share something, or comment on something that you like, Facebook puts together an algorithm that says, okay, I'm going to show this person more and more things that are like that, which ultimately ends up meaning that you only ever see things, you only ever read things that you already agree with. Facebook knows what you agree with, what you like, what you believe in, and that's the stuff that it shows you. And of course, that means that we become more polarized, don't we? We become more entrenched in our opinions, our stances and viewpoints. In a world that's riddled by issues, sometimes these can seem like really troubling times, can't they? Really turbulent times. But I want to suggest through this series that at the heart of all of those issues, whatever they are, is the same basic fundamental diagnosis. And it's that we've lost the ability to talk to each other. And this is why we need to learn how to talk about the elephants in the room. Now listen, you might be sitting there saying, particularly if this is your first time in church for a little while, oh boy, here's another pastor. Here's another church that's going to talk about things that churches have made a great mess of talking about in the past. And it's true, isn't it? A lot of the time churches and the Christian community has made a royal mess of talking about the issues that are plaguing the world. And I think that's usually because we've done one of three things. The first is that we've been afraid to talk about the issues. Actually, we've shied away and felt we don't want to be controversial. Or maybe we just want to avoid controversial conversations, so we refuse to talk about the issues that the world is wrestling with. Or also what we do, which is the flip side of that, is actually we become all too careless in talking about the issues. That actually we're way too ready to jump in and have a fight and give the Christian biblical stance on XXX ... And often when we do that and are busy talking about issues, we don't realize we're actually trampling over real people. Or also, typically what churches do, and perhaps this is the one we do the most often, is we talk about the wrong issues. That we think we're dealing with the kind of issues and questions that culture is wrestling with and questions that culture is asking, but actually we're having a conversation with a world that is 20 years in the past. And that's why this series is not really about the big issues. Actually, it's about recognizing that before we talk about the issues, first, we need to learn how to talk. We need to learn how to talk to each other, how to listen and learn from one another, even how to disagree without destroying each other, to disagree constructively, to stop hurling grenades from our trenches and instead meet one another no matter where we stand and journey together toward Jesus. So I'm excited to jump into that with you guys tonight. As we launch into this series, here's a question to wrestle with around your tables for the next 5 or 6 minutes. What are some of the issues that define our time? What are some of the issues that define our time? Now, caveat to that, I'm not asking for your opinion on those issues. Why don't we just leave that over here just for now? But what are some of the issues that you can all notice and take note of that the world really seems to be wrestling through right now? What are the issues that define us, and what are the issues that often divide us? So I'm going to give you guys 5 or 6 minutes to wrestle through that on your tables, and then we'll be right back. There's an ancient Eastern story. It's been told for thousands and thousands of years, and it's about a group of blind men that are tasked to try to describe an elephant. Sounds like a joke. It's not a joke. There's no punchline to this story. It's a real story. The first blind man feels the trunk of the elephant, and he says, I guess an elephant looks something like a snake. It's long and it's strong and it's muscular. The second guy says, what are you talking about? That's nothing like an elephant. And he runs his hand over the hide of the elephant and says, no, an elephant's like a huge, great wall that's rough and scaly. And then the third guy says, what on earth are you guys seeing? What are you talking about? That's nothing like an elephant. An elephant feels the tail. He says, an elephant is just long and skinny and slender. And then the last guy feels the tusk and he says, I have no idea what you guys are describing, but it isn't an elephant. Because an elephant is bony and brittle and hard. That story's been told for thousands of years in thousands of ways to give thousands of kinds of morals and metaphors. But for us, it's an amazing picture, isn't it, of why we find it so difficult to talk about the big issues of our time. Because often we think we're talking about the same thing. We think when we talk about issues that we have the same idea of what constitutes the biggest questions and problems and challenges that we need to speak into and address. But in reality, we're seeing radically different things. Maybe for one of us, the elephant in the room is the question of same-sex attraction. Maybe for the other, the elephant in the room is transgenderism. And for another, it's race. And for another, it's immigration. And for another, it's money and greed. And all of us think that we're talking about the same thing, but actually, as long as we're hurling grenades, as long as we're talking over each other, we'll never really be able to move from how can you think that's what an elephant is to maybe we're seeing the same thing in different ways. Which is why before we talk about the big issues, first we need to learn how we talk about the big issues. And I want to suggest tonight that a good place for us to start is by acknowledging and remembering that when we think we're talking about issues, we are always really talking about people. When we're busy fighting over who's got the issue right, we can't see that the thing that we're really talking about isn't an issue at all. Actually, it's a life, and it's a name, and it's a soul and a story. Which is why tonight, as we begin this conversation that we're going to circle back to again and again throughout the coming years, I want to lay the most important groundwork and foundation that I possibly can, which is to say this. And if you hear nothing else that I say tonight, hear this. People are not issues. People are not issues. You see, the picture of an elephant is a good one, isn't it? Not only because we're talking about the elephants in the room, the big things that everyone notices but nobody really knows how to address. Actually, the elephant is a good picture for this conversation because often we rush in to talk about the big issues and we don't realize, like a clumsy old elephant, that actually we're trampling over real people. We're trampling over real lives and stories that need to be acknowledged and remembered. And so before we start talking about the issues, first we need to realize that we're never really talking just about issues, are we? We're always talking about people. We're always talking about stories. We're always talking about names and faces that need to be treated not as an issue to be solved, but as a soul to be loved. My closest friend at university, I lived with him for 3 years. We were in the same programs, so we went to all the same classes together. We did lots of things together. We even spent a week on the streets of London together, ministering to the homeless. He was probably the closest friend, not only that I had at university, but probably that I ever had. And beyond that, he was one of the most passionate, sincere, die-hard, leave everything in the arena kind of Christians that I've ever met. But ultimately, after university or during university, we had a couple of disruptions in our friendship, and we fell out of touch, as often happens even with closest friends. I moved to Africa, and he moved to London. And we didn't speak after that for about 3 or 4 years, probably. Years later, I discovered that at some point in the time between our fallout and then us reconnecting a little bit, he'd actually come out as gay. And I looked back, and if you have any friends who have been through that experience and have tried to share that experience with you, then maybe you resonate when I say that I looked back and I tried to work out if this was something that he'd been trying to tell us. If maybe he'd been testing the water with his closest friends at university. If maybe he was asking us, is this something that you can accept about me, or will it change how you see me? And one of the greatest regrets of my whole life is that at that time, I didn't have the emotional resources to be able to recognize what he was saying and to be able to respond to it. And so instead, nothing came of it. After university, he moved to London, as I said, and he got involved in a church. He was passionately invested in this community. He became a home group leader, he was a worship leader, he was a preacher at the church. And it's at some point in that time and experience that he came out as gay. The church, as often churches do, didn't know what to make of this experience, didn't know what to make of this encounter, and ultimately, whether because they pushed him out or because he felt pushed out, he was forced to leave that community. I heard just 2 weeks ago when I was in the UK from mutual friends of ours that actually after he left that church, he not only left community behind, but he actually left faith behind. Preston Sprinkle says this: people will always gravitate to where they are loved, and if they don't find love in the church, they'll go elsewhere. I wonder if the way that church treated my friend is emblematic of the way churches often trample over people because they're in a rush to try to deal with issues. I have a hunch that every person in this room has some story that sounds something like my friend's. A story of a person or people who live in the painfully difficult understanding that the identity that defines them, they know that that is somebody else's idea of exactly what is wrong with the world. People who had to watch as their friends and family and even their faith communities no longer saw them for who they are, but for the issues that define them. I think the question for us to wrestle with as a Christian community here is, how do we journey with people in a way that looks like Jesus? How do you and I begin to speak into issues and elephants and questions without leaving behind us the collateral damage of real lives and real names and real stories? I think a good place to start is for us to turn to Jesus. Throughout the Gospels, people are constantly coming to Jesus and trying to box him in to categories and sides and stances and politics to see where he stands on issues that defined their time. In today's terms, people are effectively coming to Jesus to try to work out, is he a liberal or is he a conservative? Is he pro-choice or is he pro-life? The deepest issues that defined their time, they want to box him in to a side. And time and again, Jesus refuses to play that game on their terms. Time and again, he refuses to speak into questions that he knows aren't truly an issue to be solved, but a person that needs to be acknowledged. One of my favorite stories of this happening is in John 8, and I want to spend a little bit of time in it tonight, if that's okay. It says this: early in the morning, Jesus came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who'd been caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" Let's park it there just for a couple of minutes, because there's a couple of dynamics at play here that often we maybe fail to catch. The first thing to note is that in first century Judaism, when this is occurring, these Pharisees and scribes that the story talks about are not just philosophers. They're not locked in their ivory towers getting PhDs in the Mosaic law. Actually, they took it upon themselves to police the law, to enforce the Mosaic commandments, which meant that they'd become experts in practice on the deepest issues of their time. If there was anybody in their time that was the most equipped to give an answer about the definitive issues, then it was these guys. Which is why it's interesting to note how quickly they're willing to break the law. You see, let me tell you this. In first century Judaism, if you catch people in an act of adultery, then you are law-bound to punish the man and the woman. Because I don't know if you know, and I don't want to go too deep into this if you don't know, but in an act of adultery, there's always two people involved in that procedure. So if you catch one, you by definition catch the other one, right? And you're forced to punish the man and the woman, but here they only bring the woman. Which is interesting, isn't it? Because these policemen of the Mosaic law are already reframing the issue around their own prejudice and their own preference. They're acting like adjudicators of the law, but they've already broken the law. See, we often do this, don't we? We think that we can talk about issues in an objective way. We think that we can deal with them and define them philosophically and hypothetically and rhetorically. But in reality, we know, even if we don't admit it, that we always bring something of ourself into the conversation. Maybe it's unspoken. Maybe We don't even recognize that we're doing it, but we always bring some measure of prejudice in. We always bring some measure of preference or preconceived ideas about what the true answer to this issue is, don't we? And actually, that makes it impossible to truly deal with the issue. So the Pharisees come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, this is a black and white case of adultery. What do you say? They're making it about the issue so they don't have to do the much, much harder work of actually acknowledging and encountering the person involved in the issue. They're talking about issues without talking about real people. And anytime you or I or anybody else talks about issues without talking about real people, we rob the humanity of those for whom this is not an issue to be solved. It's a journey that they're walking through. This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and he wrote with his finger on the ground. As they continued to ask him, he stood up and he said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and he wrote on the ground. How many of you know that Jesus was always surprising? He could be called any number of things. You might not even like Jesus, but you have to at least concede that he is surprising. You come to him asking for a black and white answer, an easy equation, a plug and play quick fix, and instead he tells you, let's go fishing. Or he tells you a story about a woman and a lost coin. Or he calls over a child and he says, the answer to your question is that you need to be more like this. Or he bends down and he starts doodling in the dirt. See, Jesus was always an expert at disarming the conversation, at shifting the trajectory of the issue. Which is why I have a hunch that no matter how much we fight to get the Christian answer to the most pressing issues of our time, were we to actually ask Jesus the answer to those questions, that would be an incredibly infuriating exercise. Have you ever been in an argument where you're getting all flustered and you're getting all hot and bothered, and then the other side is just calm and collected? Is there anything more annoying and infuriating than that? Last Christmas, Emily and I flew to the UK, and on the way back, we had a terrible experience in the airport. I can say this because it was in London Heathrow, so it's my people, and they're not good. We're not good at doing that kind of administrative thing. So they're telling me I can't fly to Canada because I don't have a visa, and I'm like, yeah, that's great, but I live there, so I don't get why I need a visa. And they're like, no, you really do. So we're trying to sort this out. And then there's something wrong with our luggage, and nothing comes together. And ultimately, anyway, Emily and I end up running as fast as we can. She loses all her stuff in security because naturally they see how quickly we're trying to get to the plane. And they're like, we should probably search their bags in detail. So she just leaves everything behind and runs for the plane. We just get on, just as the plane is about to take off. And I am mad, like fuming mad. Now, it made it worse. This isn't a relevant part of the story. But as I got on, and I can just feel how angry I am, 2 different West Siders are on the plane. And they're like, hey, Adam, how's it going? And I'm like, literally couldn't have seen your pastor in a worse moment than this. But anyway, I sit down. The air hostess comes over, and I just snap at her. Just so mad. Nothing to do with her, but just so mad. She walks off. She comes back 10 minutes later, and I feel so ashamed of myself. I think she's going to yell at me. I think she's going to, I don't know, kick me off of the plane. Although I think we're in flight, so that was probably unlikely. But what she does is she comes over and she kneels down by my seat. She says this, seems like you guys have had a really tough day. I'm going to give you a complimentary meal. In fact, I'll give you some complimentary drinks. In fact, I'm going to give you a complimentary iPad so you can watch whatever you want on the plane as you fly over. Now, when that happens, you're supposed to go, that's just beautiful. You're just the most graceful person. Actually, it's just infuriating because it makes you feel so bad about how you responded, doesn't it? See, there's something about disarming the conversation. There's something about refusing to play the game that the other side is trying to pull you into that shifts the terms of the conversation. And it reminds you and it reminds the other person that this isn't really an issue that needs to be solved, is it? Actually, it's a person that just needs to be acknowledged. Jesus says, let him who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. He shifts the terms of the conversation. He says, I won't fight on those terms because your categories are all wrong. You think it's about this, but really it's about this. They're both talking about the same elephant in the room, but they're seeing radically, radically different things. And so Jesus refuses to deal with an issue as long as the other side fail to recognize it's a much bigger elephant than they realize. Because it's not really about adultery. It's about the state of all of our hearts before a holy God. When they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up. He said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." Notice the order here, because it's a little backwards from the way we expect it. He says, "Neither do I condemn you." He says, "I refuse to view you as the sum of your issues, like everybody else does." And then he says, "Therefore go, sin no more." See, you and I tend to get this the wrong way around, don't we? We say, hey, if you just sort out your behavior and choices and decisions, if you just overcome the issues that define you and make you a problematic figure to the rest of us, then you can go to God. But Jesus comes along, and as Jesus always does, he reverses the order. He flips the whole thing on its head, because grace always gets there first. So that changes the terms of the conversation, doesn't it? What if the conversation about the elephants in the room doesn't really begin with the issues at all? What if the conversation about elephants isn't really about homosexuality? What if it's not really about money and greed? What if it's not really about transgenderism and race? Actually, what if it begins with an encounter with a grace that refuses to measure you by the sum of your issues? And remember, friends, whether you're here as someone who identifies as a Jesus follower tonight or not, this is the beginning of all of our stories. This is the beginning. Grace is the beginning of all of our stories. But how quickly do we forget that when it's not our issues that we're dealing with and talking about, it's somebody else's? I wonder how much of the church's engagement with the biggest issues of our time would just be resolved if only we'd begin the conversation with the words, "I don't condemn you." Elsewhere in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul picks up on the same idea. And as I read his words, I find myself thinking maybe he got the idea from a little story about Jesus doodling in the sand. He says this, "What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside." By the way, I've never yet heard somebody quote that verse as the governing practice in how Jesus followers engage with the world. We draw a line in the sand, like Jesus did, but our line separates righteous from wicked, good from bad, people on the right side of the issue and people who have the wrong opinion on that issue. And Jesus comes along and he draws a line in the sand as well, but it's a different kind of line. Because the line is not between good and evil. It's not between wicked and righteous. The line is between those who have encountered this shattering grace and those who haven't. And he says, if you have encountered it, if you know the story that says, "I don't condemn you," then the word comes, "Go and sin no more." But if you haven't encountered that grace, then no amount of pulpit pushing and picketing and preaching, no amount of changing your opinion or behavior will move you one iota closer to God. Because the word that says "go and sin no more" is powerless unless it's preceded by the word that says, "Neither do I condemn you." Things have to change. Issues have to be engaged with and resolved and journeyed through, but grace always gets there first. I think there's more than one way to judge someone, isn't there? There's what we can maybe call hard judgment. And this happens a lot, but none of us really admit it. We dehumanize somebody by letting their issues exclude them from relationship. And so people just become nameless, like the woman in the story. She doesn't have a name. What is she? She's the woman caught in adultery. She's the sum of her issues. And we start to say, that guy isn't really welcome here because, insert issue here. Hard judgment happens in church all too much. But there's a more dangerous condition. More dangerous because it happens an awful lot more and because it's an awful lot harder to detect. Soft judgment. Soft judgment is when we don't hate people and we don't exclude people because of their issues, but we still let their issues define them. We still see people as the sum of their issues. And we do this in subtle ways. Like my friend, it's easy for me to say, if only my friend could move beyond his same-sex attraction, maybe he would be closer to Jesus. And that becomes the definitive issue of his life. He's no longer my friend, he's what? My gay friend. But what if he's not? What if when God looks at my friend from university, he doesn't see him and describe him as gay, but as a beloved child of God? As someone that he looks at and says, neither do I condemn you, because you're wrestling through your broken pieces just like all the rest of us. This is why we need to start with grace. Starting with grace means not naming the issue. It means naming the person. And something amazing happens when we refuse to start by drawing a line in the sand between good and bad, between right and wrong. When we refuse to start with the issue, and instead we start by acknowledging the deep humanity and God-givenness of the person. A friend of mine in Africa who has 3 unruly kids, like feral kids, as in, I'm not exaggerating, they literally run around naked if you don't grab them and force clothes on them. So I don't really take my parenting tips from him. I'm not a parent yet, but when I am, I probably won't go to him. But he actually gave me a really great piece of advice once about raising kids. He said that his firstborn had gotten into a spot of trouble, and time and again he kept doing this same thing, and he was trying to push him past him. And my friend used to say to him these words, "You're a bad boy. Don't do that. That's what bad boys do. Don't do that. You're a bad boy." And as much as he said that to his son, it had no effect on his behavior, ever. And then one day he decided to shift his strategy. He caught his son doing the same thing, grabbed him, and he said, "Son, you're a good boy. And good boys don't do that. Good boys don't do that." The kid never did it again. See, something amazing happens when we refuse to name the issue, but we start by naming the person. By saying, you are not the sum of the things that make you different from me. You aren't the sum of the things that other people look at and say, that's wrong. You are this. And those are the issues that you just happen to journey through. So let me suggest as we close that a helpful benchmark for you and I, before we storm into a discussion and a debate and a conversation on the big issues, whatever those are for you, before we jump in when somebody just opens that door to say, hey, what do you think about ... A helpful benchmark for you and I is before we plant our flag in the ground, first ask ourselves, have I wept over this? Can I suggest tonight that you choose not to speak into an issue that you haven't first wept over? Or put differently, can I suggest that we don't speak into issues and deal with questions that we can't give a real name to? If you can't put a name and a face and a story to this, don't talk about it. Because for everything that to you is just an issue to be solved, to somebody else is a chapter or a plot line in their story. So as I close, my challenge for us is this. Life gives you daily opportunities, daily, to reduce people down to the sum of their issues. You see a drunk guy sprawled out on the LRT at 9 in the morning. You see a poorly dressed young woman who's walking down the street with a pushchair and some rowdy kids. You see a corporate suit on a cell phone. Or you see a friend who opens up about an issue and about broken pieces that they find really difficult to talk about. And my challenge to you and to me tonight is when life gives you that opportunity to shortcut and to reduce somebody down to their most glaringly obvious issues, choose to do the hard work. Choose to do the hard work of not seeing them as the sum of that, but seeing them as God sees them. This afternoon I got a call from somebody who I've had a very distant relationship with in Calgary over the last few years because she just calls me every time she needs some food. She and her family are very vulnerable, very poor, and they live quite a long way away from West Side. So every now and then she'll drop me a line and say, hey, we just need a little extra hand again. This was the first time, though, that I said, you know what? Instead of making you come to me or meeting halfway in a Starbucks somewhere, I'll come out to you. And I drove out to her house. It was a long way away. It was far in the northeast. And when I got there, her house was in tatters. Tiny, tiny house. Maybe the smallest house I've ever seen in Calgary. And the windows were all smashed, and the door was hanging off the hinge, and you could hear the dog barking inside. The garden's a mess. The car's basically a ruin. And I found myself thinking how easy it would be to shortcut, to see her as the sum of the issues that must be behind somebody who lives in a house like this. Somebody who has to call a pastor she barely knows to ask for food a couple of times a year. How easy it would be to take the short route of saying, that is who she is, instead of saying, this is my friend Rachel. This is how God sees her. Because for all of us, the grace that gets there first, the grace that names you and me, the grace that doesn't reduce us down to our faults and failings and issues, but chooses to call us by name, that grace is the beginning of your story and my story and Rachel's story and my friend from university's story. So may we remember that tonight. Listen, we're going to close here, and I'll have this question rather on screen for you guys to wrestle through if you want to, otherwise you can take off. The question is this: what issues do you need to give a name and a story to? What issues do you need to give a name and a story to? Think back to the first question we had. What are the big issues of our time as you see it? And ask that differently. Which ones are you really passionate about? Which ones do you have a solid stance on? You know exactly which hill you're going to die on and which place you're going to plant your flag on that issue. And ask yourself this: does that issue that you're so passionate about have a name? Does it have a story behind it? Does it have a face that you're able to give it? And if not, I want you to pray that God will bring that into your life. Because when we make it about an issue, it becomes much, much easier to give and merit judgment. But when we give that issue a name and a face and a story, it becomes almost impossible to talk about it without bringing grace into the conversation.